Jim Miller had never been one to take risks. He liked his routines, his quiet life in suburban Ohio. At 55, he had recently retired from a long career in corporate management. The house he lived in had always been full of laughter, but now, after his wife's death 3 years ago, it was empty. The walls echoed with silence. That Saturday morning, something felt different. Jim had been cooped up in the house for far too long, and he needed a break from the stillness that had begun to close in on him. So he decided to drive down a road he hadn't been on in years. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a change of scenery, something to break the monotony of his daily life. The sky was overcast, casting a gray hue over everything. Jim drove slowly, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound. His eyes wandered from the road to the fields on either side of him, but it was when he veered off onto a forgotten side road that he saw it. A lump of fur by the edge of the road caught his attention. It was motionless, lying next to a rusted drainage ditch like some forgotten object. At first, Jim thought it was just a dead animal, a stray dog maybe, or something worse. He slowed down, his mind already preparing for the worst. Maybe he could help, or at the very least, give the poor creature a decent burial. He pulled over, his heart heavy with an unfamiliar sense of duty. Stepping out of the car, he walked cautiously toward the figure. The old dog was covered in matted gray fur, its body dirty and thin. For a moment, Jim just stood there, unsure of what to do. But then, something caught his eye. A slight flicker of movement. One ear twitched. The dog was alive. His heart skipped a beat. Jim approached carefully, not wanting to startle it. He crouched down beside the dog, speaking softly. "Hey buddy, you okay?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The dog's eyes opened slightly, cloudy with age, but still alert enough to make out Jim's figure. It didn't growl or flinch. It just looked up at him with the saddest, most peaceful eyes Jim had ever seen. The dog's calm demeanor struck him deeply. It was as if the dog knew it had found someone who cared. Jim's heart softened in that instant. There was no way he could leave it there. Without a second thought, Jim gently reached out to touch the dog. His hand shook slightly as he tried to lift it. The dog's body was heavy, more so than Jim had anticipated, but with some effort, he managed to get the animal into his truck. He wrapped it in an old blanket he found in the back seat, and the dog seemed to collapse onto it, letting out a soft sigh. Jim's eyes filled with tears as he started the engine, heading straight to the local vet. The vet's office was quiet when they arrived. Just one receptionist sat at the front desk, a young vet tech behind her. Jim quickly explained how he found the dog on the side of the road, unsure of how long it had been there. The vet immediately set to work, running tests and checking the dog for injuries. It didn't take long for the vet to confirm that the dog, an elderly male, had no microchip or collar. There was no way to trace where he had come from or how he had ended up alone on that road. The dog was severely dehydrated and underweight, covered in fleas, and had some arthritis in his hips. The vet estimated his age to be around 12 or 13 years old. Jim could see the concern in the vet's eyes as she spoke. Most people wouldn't adopt a dog this old, the vet said gently, wrapping a bandage around his paw where blood had been drawn. "Are you sure about this?" Jim didn't have a plan. He hadn't thought about what it would take to care for an old dog, especially one that seemed so fragile. But looking down at the dog, Jim knew there was no going back. The dog had already claimed a part of his heart, and he wasn't about to leave it behind. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." The vet smiled kindly, though a bit skeptical. "Well, we'll get him checked out and make sure he's stable. But be prepared, it could be tough to take care of him." Jim didn't mind. He hadn't been living with much purpose since his wife's passing, and something about this old dog made him feel needed again. Maybe, just maybe, this dog could give him the companionship he had been missing. Jim took the dog home that day. He didn't know what to call him at first, but as he looked at the dog's gray face, the name Charlie came to him. It felt right. Charlie looked at Jim with those same sad eyes, but for the first time in a long time, Jim didn't feel so alone. That first night, Charlie curled up at the foot of Jim's bed. There were no whines, no barking, just a soft sigh as the dog fell into a deep sleep. Jim lay awake for hours, watching Charlie's calm breathing. For the first time in years, Jim didn't feel the crushing loneliness that had followed him since his wife's death. In the days that followed, Jim and Charlie began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Jim took Charlie on short walks, fed him soft food as recommended by the vet, and gave him his pills wrapped in cheese. Charlie followed Jim everywhere, like a shadow, and Jim found himself talking to the dog like he was an old friend. It was odd, but somehow comforting. Charlie didn't talk, of course. He couldn't, but Jim felt like he understood him. The dog listened, always. And for Jim, that was more than enough. But what Jim didn't know yet was that Charlie was about to reveal something that would change everything. The mystery of the dog's past was just beginning, and as Jim would soon discover, Charlie had more to offer than just companionship. Over the next few days, Jim found a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The house felt a little less empty, and his morning routine, once solitary and quiet, now included the comforting presence of Charlie by his side. Charlie didn't ask for much. He was content to lie beside Jim as he drank his coffee, or to quietly sit at his feet during the evenings when Jim watched TV. There was something about the dog's quiet companionship that filled the silence of the house in a way that nothing else could. Jim didn't know what Charlie's life had been like before that fateful day on the side of the road. The dog didn't seem to have any particular fondness for food or toys, and he avoided certain noises, as if they triggered memories Jim couldn't understand. But despite his age and the obvious signs of a hard life, Charlie had an unwavering calmness about him. It was as though the dog had seen it all and learned to accept the world as it was. The vet had warned Jim that caring for an older dog could be difficult. Charlie's arthritis made it hard for him to move around comfortably, and Jim had to adjust the furniture to make sure Charlie had a soft spot to lie down. He even set up a special bed by the fireplace, where Charlie spent most of his time, watching the flames dance. It was on the 7th day, during one of their regular quiet moments, that Jim's curiosity about Charlie's past took a strange turn. Jim had gotten into the habit of brushing Charlie's fur, trying to keep him comfortable and clean. Charlie seemed to enjoy it, his eyes half closed as Jim ran the brush through his thick, matted fur. Jim was careful, working through tangles, his fingers slow and gentle. But as he brushed behind Charlie's right ear, something odd happened. His fingers brushed against something hard, something that didn't feel like skin or bone. At first, Jim thought it was a clump of dried sap, or perhaps a burr, but as he parted the fur, he realized it was something much stranger. A small round object was embedded in Charlie's skin, almost hidden beneath the layers of fur. It wasn't a growth, and it wasn't a tick. It was something metallic, something man-made. Jim froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected to find anything like this. What could it be? A tracker? A tag? His mind raced with possibilities, and a sense of unease settled in his stomach. He knew he had to find out what it was, but at the same time, he didn't want to hurt Charlie in the process. His heart ached at the thought that this dog, who had already been through so much, might have a past even darker than he could imagine. Without wasting another second, Jim took out his phone and called the vet. "Dr. Morgan," he said when she picked up, his voice filled with urgency. "I think I found something on Charlie's neck. It's like a small metal disc, and I have no idea what it is. Should I bring him in?" Dr. Morgan's voice was calm, but Jim could hear the concern in her words. "Bring him in right away, Jim. We'll take a look at it." Jim grabbed Charlie's leash, his hand shaking slightly. "It's okay, boy," he whispered to Charlie, who looked up at him with those familiar, wise eyes. The dog didn't flinch, didn't seem alarmed. Instead, he let Jim gently guide him into the car, his body slow but steady. When they arrived at the vet's office, Jim explained the situation to Dr. Morgan. She examined the spot where Jim had found the object and immediately decided that an X-ray was needed. The small disc didn't look like anything she'd ever encountered, and she wanted to make sure it wasn't causing any harm to Charlie. As Jim waited in the quiet vet's office, he could hear the faint sound of Charlie's breathing. The dog lay quietly on the exam table, as if he knew this was just another part of his journey. Jim couldn't help but wonder who had placed this strange object on Charlie and why. The X-ray results came back within the hour, and the moment Jim saw the images on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. There, clearly visible, was the small metal disc nestled just beneath Charlie's skin. It wasn't just under the surface. It seemed to be embedded between layers of tissue. It didn't appear to be connected to anything vital, but it was definitely something out of the ordinary. Dr. Morgan furrowed her brow as she examined the images more closely. "This isn't a standard microchip," she said softly. "It looks like some kind of implant, but I've never seen anything like it, and it's too deep for it to have just happened by accident." Jim felt a knot form in his stomach. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not sure," Dr. Morgan replied. "But it could be some kind of medical implant or a tracking device. It's hard to say without knowing more. I'll send these scans to a specialist who might have more experience with this kind of thing. In the meantime, I wouldn't worry unless it starts causing him pain." Jim left the vet's office with more questions than answers. As he drove home, Charlie rested quietly beside him, unaware of the mystery that had just deepened. Jim couldn't stop thinking about the strange object. What if it was part of something bigger? What if Charlie's life hadn't just been a quiet existence as an abandoned dog? What if there was more to his story than anyone could imagine? That night, as Jim sat on the couch with Charlie curled up beside him, the weight of the situation settled over him like a thick fog. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Charlie was not just any dog, and whatever secrets he carried, Jim was determined to uncover them, no matter where the journey took him. He knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The following days were a blur of research, phone calls, and quiet moments spent with Charlie. Jim's mind was consumed by the mysterious implant he had found under the dog's skin. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about discovering the truth. He had to know what Charlie's life had been before he showed up on that quiet side road. Despite the unease that tugged at him, Jim couldn't help but bond with Charlie even more. The dog had become his companion in a way he never expected. Charlie followed Jim around the house like a shadow, his calm presence soothing the loneliness that had crept into Jim's life over the years. They walked together every morning, and Charlie seemed to be enjoying the fresh air, his nose constantly sniffing the ground as if tracking something unseen. It made Jim wonder, what had this dog been trained to do? Jim had always been a quiet man, and he didn't talk much to others about his thoughts, but this situation felt different. The more he thought about it, the more he believed that the dog's past was not something that could be easily explained. Something about that implant, something about the way Charlie behaved, told Jim that Charlie had been part of something bigger, something hidden. But what? That's when Jim decided to take matters into his own hands. He called the vet, Dr. Morgan, again, asking if she had learned anything new from the specialist. She had, but the news wasn't much more helpful. The specialist confirmed it's not a regular microchip, she said. It seems to be some kind of implant. I'm sending the X-ray images to a colleague in Cincinnati who specializes in this kind of thing. He may be able to shed more light on it. Jim felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the answers he was looking for were within reach. In the meantime, he decided to take another step. He drove to the local animal shelter, asking if anyone had reported a missing dog that matched Charlie's description. The shelter manager, a woman named Clara, was kind but doubtful. "We haven't had any reports of a missing dog like this," she said, studying the photo Jim had brought. "But that doesn't mean he wasn't someone's pet before. There are a lot of rural areas around here where people don't always check in with shelters." Jim nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the mystery. There was no way to track Charlie's past, no way to know how long he had been out there, waiting for someone to find him. But something about Charlie's eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, told Jim that the dog was more than just a stray. He had a history, one that Jim was determined to uncover. Over the next few days, Jim scoured the internet for any information he could find about military dog programs or government experiments involving canines. He found a few obscure articles and forums discussing dogs used for tracking and recovery operations. Some of the stories sounded too far-fetched, but there were recurring mentions of classified projects and specialized training. Could it be that Charlie had been involved in something like that? The more Jim read, the more questions he had. What kind of experiments had these dogs been part of? Why had they been discarded, left to wander the streets, forgotten by the very people who trained them? And most importantly, why had Charlie been abandoned, left to die on the side of the road? It wasn't until Jim received an unexpected call from a retired Army veteran named Tom Wilson that things began to take a clearer shape. Tom had worked in military intelligence during the late 80s and 90s, and when Jim explained Charlie's strange behavior and the implant, Tom's voice grew serious. "You might be onto something, Jim," he said. There were rumors back then about specialized K9 units, dogs trained not just to sniff out bombs or drugs, but to perform complex missions. Some of them were equipped with tracking devices, implants that weren't just for identification. They were for monitoring, keeping tabs on the dog's movements, maybe even collecting data from their surroundings. Jim's stomach tightened as he listened. Could Charlie have been one of those dogs? The idea seemed impossible, yet it explained so much. The calm demeanor, the strange behaviors, and the implant, all of it pointed to something far more complex than a simple lost pet. Tom suggested that Jim reach out to a colleague of his, Dr. Stewart, a specialist who had worked with military dogs in the past. He promised to make the introduction. A few days later, Jim found himself on the phone with Dr. Stewart, explaining everything he knew about Charlie. The specialist listened carefully, his voice thoughtful. "It sounds like your dog may have been part of a classified program," Dr. Stewart said. "If he was trained for specific tasks, tracking, reconnaissance, he could have been implanted with a device to monitor his movements. These programs were often secretive, and the dogs were discarded when they outlived their usefulness." Jim felt his heart race as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Charlie hadn't been abandoned by accident. He had been discarded, forgotten, left to die because he was no longer needed. Dr. Stewart's voice grew quieter. "The implant you found, if it's what I think it is, it could have been part of a larger experiment. The dogs were trained to operate without human intervention, to perform tasks on their own. Some of them were even trained to form bonds with people, to integrate into society like any other dog. But those bonds, they weren't always easy to break." The conversation left Jim with more questions than answers, but it also gave him a sense of direction. He had to keep going. He had to find out everything about Charlie's past, not just for his own peace of mind, but for Charlie's as well. That night, as he sat on the couch, Charlie curled up beside him. Jim thought about everything that had led him to this point. He had been lonely, lost in his own world of silence. But now, with Charlie by his side, things were different. The mystery of Charlie's past didn't just belong to the dog. It had become Jim's mystery too. Tomorrow, he would take Charlie to the specialist in Cincinnati, and together, they would uncover the truth. It was a journey neither of them had expected, but it was a journey they would take together. As Charlie slept, Jim sat in the quiet house, his mind racing with the possibilities of what they might discover. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he was certain of one thing: Charlie was no ordinary dog. And whatever the truth was, Jim was ready to face it. The morning air was crisp as Jim woke up to the familiar sound of Charlie's soft breathing at his feet. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. Charlie had become more than just a companion. He was Jim's anchor in a world that had slowly turned quiet and still after his wife's passing. Jim could feel a deep bond forming between them, an unspoken understanding. But there was something about Charlie, something deeper, that Jim couldn't shake. He had tried not to think too much about the implant, the strange object hidden beneath Charlie's fur. But the more he learned, the more convinced he became that Charlie's past was tangled in something far more complicated than a simple case of abandonment. The previous day, Jim had received a call from Dr. Stewart, the specialist who had been looking into Charlie's implant. After examining the X-rays and scans, Dr. Stewart had reached out to a contact of his, someone who had worked with military and government projects involving animals. Jim had agreed to meet this contact, and today was the day he would learn more. Jim packed a few essentials and placed Charlie's favorite blanket in the back of the truck. They were headed for Cincinnati to meet Dr. Stewart's contact, Evelyn Harper, a retired military handler who had spent years working with K-9 units. Evelyn had agreed to meet Jim, though she had been cryptic about what she knew. The thought of uncovering more about Charlie's history made Jim both excited and uneasy. The dog had already stolen a part of his heart, and Jim wasn't sure if he was ready to learn the truth. The drive to Cincinnati was long, but Charlie seemed at ease, his head resting against the window, his eyes following the passing scenery. Jim kept glancing over at the dog, his heart swelling with affection. He had never expected that finding a dog on the side of the road would change his life in such a profound way. When they arrived at the meeting point, a quiet coffee shop on the edge of the city, Jim saw Evelyn sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to have seen more than her fair share of secrets. She stood up as Jim approached, giving him a curt nod before motioning for him to sit. "Jim Miller, I assume," she said, her voice steady and direct. "You've got a dog with a history, don't you?" Jim nodded, unsure of how much to say. "Yeah, his name's Charlie. I've had him for a little over a week now. But I found something strange. There's a metallic implant under his skin, and I'm not sure what it is or why it's there. I was hoping you could help me figure it out." Evelyn's eyes flickered with recognition. "I've seen a lot of dogs like Charlie," she said quietly, "but not many like him." She paused, looking at Charlie, who was lying at Jim's feet, his eyes half closed. "He's not just a stray, Jim. He's part of something bigger, something that wasn't meant to be found." Jim leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What's his story?" Evelyn took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. "Charlie's been part of a classified military program. It's called Project Canis, an operation that trained dogs to track, locate, and retrieve objects and people in high-risk situations. Some of these dogs were used for covert operations, even search and rescue missions. But Charlie wasn't just any dog. He was trained to operate without direct supervision. He could find things on his own, without commands. The implant you found, it was a tracking device, yes, but it was also designed to monitor his movements and record his actions." Jim's heart sank as the truth began to sink in. Charlie wasn't just some old dog left to die on the side of the road. He had been trained for something far darker and more dangerous. But why had he been abandoned? What had happened to the people who trained him? Why was he left? Jim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did they just drop him? Evelyn's face softened, but her eyes grew distant. The program was shut down abruptly. Something went wrong. There was an accident. Some of the handlers were injured, and the dogs were deemed expendable. Charlie, he was supposed to be put down, but he ran. He disappeared, and no one went after him. The implant was meant to keep track of him, but it malfunctioned. They thought he was gone, dead even. But he wasn't. And now he's here with you. Jim sat back in his chair, trying to process everything Evelyn had just said. Charlie had been part of something secret, something he had never asked for. He had been trained to follow orders, to track people and objects, But in the end, he had been discarded like a broken tool. Jim's heart ached for Charlie, for the life he had lived before Jim found him. "There's more," Evelyn continued. "There were a few dogs like Charlie who were never found after the shutdown. They were part of a special unit, trained for missions that no one would ever talk about. We weren't supposed to know what they did, but rumors say they were used in high-profile operations, government missions that never made it into the public eye." Jim looked at Charlie, his mind racing. The dog had been trained for something he never chose, something that could have torn him apart. But despite everything, Charlie had survived. He had lived, and now he was with Jim, a quiet reminder of a past that would never be fully understood. Evelyn pushed a file across the table toward Jim. "This is everything we have on Project Canis. There are more dogs like Charlie out there, but most of them were lost in the process. He's one of the lucky ones, if you can call it that." Jim's fingers trembled as he picked up the file. Inside, there were photographs, training records, and mission logs. But one page stood out. It was a handwritten note, the ink smudged, the words barely legible. It read, "Charlie was different. He bonded too deeply with the handlers. He may not have been fully trained, but he had the potential to change the game." Jim stared at the page, his mind spinning. What had Charlie been through? What had he been asked to do? He couldn't imagine the pain of being part of something so secretive, so controlled, only to be abandoned when the program no longer needed him. But one thing was clear: Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a survivor, and Jim had given him a second chance. Whatever Charlie's past had been, Jim would make sure his future was filled with love and peace. That night, as they made their way home, Jim glanced at Charlie, who was resting quietly in the back seat. The dog's eyes met his, calm and steady, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jim knew, then, that no matter what secrets lay buried in Charlie's past, their story wasn't over. It was just beginning.